Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and how to build great teams. I'm the author of the book, Mission First People Always, the definitive guide to balancing people and performance, and it's available on Amazon or wherever you buy books online. I'm also a trainer, consultant, and coach focused on leader and team development. Let me remind you, as I always do, please subscribe or follow, leave a review, and tell a friend about our podcast. I do this podcast because I sincerely want to help people lead better and get more done with their team. I had several people approach me just this week at a speaking event I did to tell me that they were using the podcast as part of their team's internal leadership development program. In other words, they were inviting everyone on the team to listen to the podcast, and then they'd get together a few days later over a brown bag lunch or pizza or whatever to talk about the conversation we had on the episode. And this person told me that it was really benefiting their team and providing a great forum for good conversations about how they could get better. So I love that idea. It's kind of like a book club, but for podcasts. Now let's focus on today's episode. I'm excited that you're here because I think you're going to really like this episode. The reason I'm excited about today's episode is because my guest is a senior human resources executive who has a very worldly perspective on team development and bringing out the best in people. Now, by worldly, I mean he has worked in 9 different countries during his 30-year career in a wide array of cross-cultural working environments. In each of these different cultural settings, he has discovered the key to success. It's getting people to work better together. After all that he has seen and done, he remains tremendously optimistic about what highly effective teams to accomplish. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about better business results, stronger teams, more successful careers, and happier lives. Along the way, we hope to bust some biases, build some bridges, and have some fun. We're glad you're here. And now, our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
My guest today is Pete Baker. Pete is the Vice President of HR for Amcor Rigid Packaging, a world leader in the manufacturing of rigid packaging for the food, beverage, spirits, personal care, home care, and healthcare industries. They've got facilities in 61 different locations around the world and 12 different countries. Bottom line, Amcor is the world's leader in creating packaging products, all the things that we use from the grocery store and the pharmacy, the packages that stuff comes in. His company basically made it, more than likely. Pete has had a varied career in a variety of senior HR roles. Fairly recently, he was at First Abu Dhabi Bank as the senior HR leader there. First Abu Dhabi Bank is the largest bank in the Middle East. He's worked for Maersk, the big shipping company. He started his career, or earlier in his career, he was with Procter & Gamble, one of the largest enterprises in the world. You'll quickly hear that he is a native of Australia. His career has taken him to 9 different countries around the world. He's presently in the beautiful city of Ann Arbor, Michigan. He just told me he's enjoying the winter. And Pete's passion for business within business is driving team effectiveness and leadership transportation. So I'm excited to have this conversation with Pete. Pete, welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast.
Thanks, Mike. It's really great to be here. Great to have a chance to dialogue with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, we've known each other for a long time, but it has been a long distance relationship of late, mostly via emails and LinkedIn. But it's really great to reconnect with you on the podcast today. You know, I've watched you move through your career. We met when you were in a couple of positions ago. You've had a fascinating career journey. Your LinkedIn profile is a travel log of your, professional life around the world. And I've always just been curious, and fascinated, in fact, about what inspires someone to pursue an international business career. You left your home country early on. You've been everywhere in the world, different cultures, different companies. Can you give us a short version of that professional journey? Because I think folks would be interested in hearing it.
Sure, absolutely, Mike. I'll try to give the short version. But it does start, of course, at the beginning. And I was lucky to graduate from university, right at the end of the communist era. And so I went to Eastern Europe for my first job and worked in Bulgaria in the very early 1990s as that society was opening up. And I worked for Shell as my very first job in Bulgaria at a time of astonishing transformation. And I guess that just opened my eyes to realizing the possibilities and the opportunities of an international career. I spent 17 years with Procter & Gamble. And so kind of in reality, the career started in the P&G graduate program once I returned back from Bulgaria, started in Australia, and started in sales. And actually, sales is a great place for people to start their career when you have to, particularly right at the beginning, when you're making multiple customer calls every day, handling objections, negotiating, trying to come to an agreement, trying to close the sale. Building that muscle is an astonishing muscle to build that has helped me in my 30 years in business, even though I eventually moved out of sales and into HR. So I was lucky enough to have a kind of first part of my career in sales, kind of gradually leading bigger and bigger customer teams. But one of the things about Procter & Gamble, it's a great organization, and it primarily promotes from within, and it takes talent development very seriously. And so I got an opportunity to do a 3 or 4 month broadening assignment in human resources that turned into a lifelong passion. And the short assignment in HR really opened my eyes to culture and capability and team effectiveness and leadership development and talent development and transformation and all of the things that I have loved doing kind of every day of my life since. So, I was lucky enough to work in P&G's HR team at a time that we were doing a lot of acquisitions within beauty care. And so I was able to move to Singapore and work for a number of years in Asia as we were bringing in different beauty care companies into the P&G portfolio. So at the time when we acquired the beauty care business for Gucci and Dolce & Gabbana and Hugo Boss, I was the HR leader integrating those businesses into P&G, which kind of taught me a lot about change management and about kind of managing resistance within organizations. It also taught me a lot about, you can win people's minds, but it's difficult to win people's hearts. And that was a particularly difficult acquisition journey for P&G, and one that they subsequently reversed kind of a decade later and actually spun those businesses off when they realized that they weren't really able to bring them into the P&G portfolio. Yeah. So, after 17 years with P&G, I left to work for Maersk, the shipping company. And, with the global leader in container shipping, I was living in Singapore at the time and felt that it was time for me to leave P&G. And living in Singapore, it's the biggest shipping city in the world, and Maersk is the biggest shipping company in the world. And I thought, this will be able to keep me in Singapore for a while, and I can raise my family in Singapore. And of course, Mike, very well, things don't always end the way that you plan. So, within a couple of years of Maersk in Singapore, I got the opportunity then to move to the global headquarters in Copenhagen, which is where I first met you, Mike, when I was the head of leadership and organization development for Maersk. And, a great role, my first global role, with the opportunity to really start the transformation journey for a global shipping organization like Maersk. And, that was a wonderful lessons for me around, really trying to drive culture and capability at scale during a time of a pretty difficult economic time, really. And so just a lot of wonderful lessons for me there that I take to heart very well. Through a couple of different roles at Maersk, including one as the CHRO of Maersk's freight forwarding and supply chain business, which is called Amcor. I ended up in the Netherlands, and then one of my jobs was to effectively fold that business back into the core of Maersk. And it's one of the toughest things that you have to do, to kind of close down your own job and merge it back into the parent company. But it was the right thing to do. And I think as a HR leader, one of the things that all HR leaders need to do is to design an organization to support the strategy. And it was clear that part of the business didn't have a right to win as a standalone entity. And so, I then led the project to refold that business back into Maersk, and effectively to start the process of closing down the Damco business as an independent entity. And now it's a very successful part of Maersk. And then one door closes and one door opens. So when that opportunity, when that role closed down, I then cast my eyes a little bit further afield and went to the Middle East. And I was the CEO for First Abu Dhabi Bank, which is the largest bank in the Middle East. And that was at a time that basically two banks were merging together. The National Bank of Abu Dhabi and First Gulf Bank merged together, and they wanted to have a CHRO who was not from either of the two banks, previous banks. They wanted someone who was completely new. And so what an opportunity that was. I'd not worked in banking. I'd not worked in the Middle East. And all of a sudden I'm sitting as the head of HR for the largest bank in the region. But a wonderful learning opportunity for me, and a wonderful opportunity to partner with a leader who I just loved and respected as the CEO of that business, who was an amazing CEO who taught me a huge amount around strategy, around leadership, around transformation. Just really a wonderful experience for me there. And sometimes when you wake up and you think everything's going fantastic, I just want tomorrow to be as good as today or as good as yesterday, and this is great. Some things happen. We had a slightly unplanned leadership change at First Abu Dhabi Bank. So new CEO, old CEO decided to retire. New CEO comes in, and CEOs get to pick their own team. And I think that's the number one rule for me as a HR leader is I want to work for someone who wants to work with me. And the new CEO made it very clear that she wanted to bring in her own team and her own people. And in my view, she has every right to do that. And she has done that. But that meant that myself and various others were very quickly exited from the business. And she then proceeded to build her own team with her own people. That were seen as a bit less connected to the previous CEO. So,
Pete, how did it? Let me jump in here because I'm fascinated by this trip around the world with your career, but it must have been really hard to be on the top of the ladder, the pinnacle of your career. You were delivering your A game every day. Life couldn't be better. And then it all changed literally in an instant. How did that change the way you think about career and hierarchy and status and all the things that many of us have really focused on, maybe unduly focused on? And it was all gone for you in a moment. And you've landed well and you're doing great and you're back on top again. But there must have been a day or two or week or two or month or two where you really reflected and asked yourself, what's going on here? What am I doing? What are my priorities? What are my values? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely right, Mike. Absolutely. It was a difficult, very, very difficult experience for me, but I'd never encountered it before. And you do go through the normal range of human emotions, you know, the denial and the anger and the how could this happen to me? And this is totally unfair. And I think I've frankly seen it from others throughout my career. But when you're experiencing it yourself, it's pretty tough and pretty difficult. Luckily enough, you know, I have a wonderfully supportive wife and a wonderfully supportive family. And so I think a lot of time when these things happen to people, they do feel very isolated. You know, I was lucky enough to be surrounded by a loving family who helped me through it. And then just like we teach in Change Management 101, right? As you go through the denial and anger, you eventually get into the dialogue and bargaining and the thinking about what might be possible. And I had a wonderful then opportunity to really think about, okay, what do I really want from the next phase in my career? What are the jobs that I have loved the most and why did I love them? And when I really thought about the work that I had done over my career, the days that had been great days at work, it actually wasn't connected to status and it wasn't connected to hierarchy. It wasn't connected to decision power. It was typically connected to, you know, am I learning something great? Am I helping someone? Am I feeling part of a team? Am I feeling I'm able to come to work and do my best every day? Do I feel kind of safe in an environment to be able to express my points of view and others feel safe to be able to express their points of view to me and we can come up with great solutions. And so when I realized that probably for the next phase in my career, you know, I wanted to find a role that met those conditions. And so I took my time. I was very, very lucky, Mike, to have perhaps a little bit the luxury of time. And so I worked for a wonderful enterprise for a year called Plastic Bank, which addresses the problem of ocean-bound plastic in vulnerable communities. So we have 17,000 collectors who we pay a living wage to. And I still say we, even though I'm not part of that organization anymore, but we pay a living wage to people in vulnerable communities to collect plastic before it goes into the ocean. And I think for me, that was a kind of a cathartic role to really think about that work can have meaning. And I could see the impact of my work, you know, in the lives of others. And so, you know, it was a social enterprise, much smaller, much less status, much less a much smaller enterprise, but taught me the value of focusing on doing work that is meaningful and interesting and working with people who are fantastic. And so, you know, I was lucky enough to kind of be able to do that for a year, you know, as part of my exit from the Middle East. And then I got in touch with companies that had inspired me kind of throughout my career. And actually Amcor, which is where I am now, I had kind of come close to accepting a role with Amcor back in 2016. And I'd stayed in touch with Amcor for the 6 years between. And I found Amcor as a wonderful company with great values. And when I think about things that have become more important to me, things like sustainability, things like, you know, our impact on the environment, I realized that it's companies like Amcor who actually will be able to drive sustainability at scale. You know, we're basically one of the largest users of recycled plastic material. You know, we have the technology, we have the scale, we have the capability to actually integrate recycled plastic into the supply chain. And that really is how humanity will address the problem of plastic waste, of finding ways to actually remanufacture it and put it back into production. And we're at the leading edge of that. So when I saw what Amcor was doing on that, and I saw what a great company it was, the great people, the great values, this is what I want to be part of. And so now I'm lucky enough to be sitting talking to you from Ann Arbor, Michigan. And you know, we lived in the US when I worked for Procter & Gamble many years ago. And it kind of feels like coming a little bit full circle, coming back to the US kind of 20 years later, still back in the Midwest and you know, enjoying, you know, what's wonderful about the Midwest of the United States.
It sounds like a great fit. And as you're describing that experience of transitioning from that CHRO position at the Middle East's largest bank, and that all ended in a minute, and then you had some time to work at a social enterprise, and that led you to where you are now. I would imagine you have a new level of empathy for people who have had to experience change maybe abruptly over the last 2, 3 years as the rug has been pulled out from under many people. Is that new sense of empathy, assuming that is the case for you, how has that affected the way you interact with people? And I know you've been in conversations where you described how you had to shut down an organization and fold it back in. You probably had hundreds of conversations with people throughout your career where you're telling them that things are going to change for them. Maybe they need to go find new employment, or maybe their job's going to be different. And has your empathy grown as more in the last 3 or 4 years, maybe than it was earlier in your career? How has that affected you?
Yeah, it really has, Mike. It really has. Because I'd had many conversations with people throughout my career in HR. Fundamentally, you sometimes have to exit people and sometimes large groups of people. And it's very easy to be flippant and say, yes, we'll act according to our values and we'll give people a good exit package. But sometimes, on reflection, I realized that I didn't do enough to really understand the humanity
Yeah.
of the people that I was working with. And so I think I've particularly tried to take that on board as I've come into the new organization. We have high performance standards here at Amcor, and sometimes we do have to say goodbye to some colleagues. But I think I'd now kind of double challenge myself to make sure, have we really done all the due diligence? Have we done everything that we can for this person? Have we given them every opportunity to perform at their best or to find a new role? And I just think that has influenced me, quite significantly in terms of my own thinking. It doesn't necessarily change some of the hard outputs that are required from HR. And I think what you're starting to see certainly in the US is quite a bit of downsizing, across multiple sectors here in the US. So you're starting to see the CEO abruptly firing everybody on a Zoom call. I'm sure you've all seen that on LinkedIn or Twitter, those kind of recordings of people acting without any sense of humanity. So it certainly makes me, when I'm in that position, I want to make sure that I've done everything I can to realize that it's a human being sitting there, and my job is to do the right thing for the organization, but also to try to do the right thing for that person so that they walk out that door feeling supported, feeling valued, even if they're no longer going to have a career within our organization.
Yeah, and I'm quite sure that the people on the other side of those conversations with you appreciate that. I mean, I think the world needs more humanity in the workplace, and that might be a good opportunity for us to transition our conversation to the humanity of teams and how people work together. And I know you're really passionate about team effectiveness. I've been in some really good teams in my career. I couldn't wait to get back to work the next day and work with these people because of the great things we're doing and how we relate to one another, and the experience of growth and how we can challenge one another very openly. But at the end of the day, we all know we're in this together, and we feel a sense of camaraderie and all of those things that we strive for. But I've been challenged, and I've been reflecting on this the last few years. How does that happen? I mean, it seems like it's great in some situations with some people in some settings, and then with other people in other situations and other settings, it's not good. It's painful to go to work, and you don't know when you're going to get kicked in the backside and when you're going to get smacked. And I don't mean literally, but just kind of emotionally. And it's hard, and it doesn't feel good to work with certain teams in certain situations. So I want to spend the next 15 minutes or so that we have together talking about how we do that, how we do that better, team effectiveness. What does it even mean? What does the effective team look like in 2023 from your perspective, Pete?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a great question. An effective team is are people working together with a collective, bringing their collective experience to solve a problem and produce a better result, right? And every team should have a debate of, are we really a team where we collectively working together towards a single goal, or are we just a selection of individuals who often happen to report to the same boss? And actually, that's an important conversation, because sometimes the way many organizations are designed, it's just a bunch of people who report to a boss but work extremely independently. But where there's interdependence, there has to be teamwork, right? And I still foundationally, when you think about the best teams and the most effective teams, the number one requirement still is trust, right? You can have all of these tools and technologies and processes and everything, but in reality, if two human beings trust each other, and then if 10 human beings trust each other, then that is, for me, the most foundational requirement for team effectiveness. If you've got the trust, you can do it. If you don't have the trust, then it's almost impossible to have an effective team, right?
And I would buy that. I'm with you on that. But now the hard question: how do we do that? How do we create that trust, especially if people are being brought together? They're new to each other. You throw us together and you give us a mission, and then you're telling us we need to trust each other. How do we do it? How do we build trust?
Great. It's a great question. I mean, I still, I know this is a podcast, so there's no visuals, but I love the very old mathematical formula for trust, which is credibility plus reliability plus intimacy divided by self-interest is kind of the mathematical way of thinking about trust. And if you think about that, I actually use that often in sessions, right? Credibility, if everyone should understand, does everybody here at this table have the credibility to be sitting in their chair, right? That's a bit tougher if someone is the son or the daughter of the boss and they've been given the job on nepotism or something. But assuming that the team is credibly able to sit in the chair and do their work, that's number one. The second is reliability, right? Do we have a history of being able to rely upon each other, right? And that's very difficult to build because it requires kind of multiple interactions. But, every time I do something good for you, Mike, it's like putting a little deposit in the trust bank account. And every time I don't keep a promise to you, it's like making a withdrawal, right? And so that kind of understanding and reflecting upon kind of our collective interaction, does that build up a sense of reliability? And if we do that, then we can create trust. But the third one is really key: intimacy, right? And when I talk about intimacy, it's the personal connection between two human beings. Right or wrong, you are more likely to trust someone if you know more about them, their personality, their needs, their motivations, their family history, their goals, their aspirations, their weaknesses. If you've got some kind of personal connection with them, then that human bond allows you to create a sense of trust. And in some cultural settings, that's particularly different. That's difficult, but it's still, the dynamics are still the same, but it's just more difficult to build in some settings. And then the denominator of that whole thing is that people feel that you are acting in your self-interest rather than the interests of the team. Then that undermines trust. You can't have trust if people perceive that the individual members of the team are working more in their own interests and not in the interests of the team. And so that's where sometimes as HR professionals, we can act in terms of making sure we've got things like the performance management system, the objectives process, the KPIs and rewards all lined up so that there's a sense of we're all collectively responsible for the result of the team rather than our own result. So, kind of as I think about kind of building trust, I do play around with those four variables and can be quite intentional in some of the discussions that I have with teams around where are we on each of these elements. And if If we're not where we need to be, what's it going to take in order to build those elements up in order to then create the conditions for trust?
And when we have trust, it's much easier to have those harder conversations and challenge one another in a safe way so that we can discuss and debate differences, maybe even very vigorously, but it's okay to push back on a colleague, kind of an iron sharpens iron approach to things. You have some thoughts on that, and I know you're passionate about this idea of you call it idea conflict versus social conflict. I talk about it with different words, but that the words aren't all that important. It's the idea, the spirit of what we're talking about here. So tell us a little bit about, why it's so important to be able to have idea conflict without it becoming interpersonal or social conflict.
That's fantastic, Mike. Thank you. A team is together because you have different skills, different perspectives, and different experiences. And so by definition, you should bring different ideas to a particular situation. So you need to have people being willing to advocate fiercely for their point of view and also listen appropriately to the point of view of the other person in order to produce the right outcome. So, creating that conditions that people can disagree with someone else's idea and then passionately propose their own idea is an absolute requirement for high performance teams. Otherwise, you're just going with the mushy middle of compromise, right? And so, but there is a real difference between idea conflict and social conflict, and that's why I come down to the trust being the foundation, right? If I trust you, if I really trust you, if I know that you're on my team and I'm on your team and we're hearing it together, if you disagree with something that I say, I'm okay with that because I will listen to your idea because I've got trust. I know you're not trying to undermine me. I know you're not trying to big note yourself. I know you're trying to help the team get better. So we're happy to have a debate and a discussion about ideas. If I don't trust you and you disagree with me, I'm going to immediately go to what's Mike trying to do here? He's trying to undermine me. He's trying to position himself for extra power, extra resources or whatever. He's trying to make me look bad. I don't trust what he's saying. And that's effectively creates social conflict where Mike and Pete start arguing with each other rather than idea A versus idea B. And so that's why kind of creating that intimacy, the reliability, and the credibility is so critical. If we can build that up, then I know that if you challenge my idea, that you're doing it for the right reasons. And then we get into a full-hearted debate about the ideas. If we can do that, we will win. If we can't do that, then we'll basically, at best, we will compromise. And my view, Mike, and I know there's a little bit of stuff in your book about compromise that it typically is the sub-optimized solution, right? It's the one we can both kind of live with. It's not the best solution for the business. So we should keep trying to debate, okay, what is really, really the best idea rather than going for the mushy middle ground that teams sometimes settle for if they're not willing to do the hard work of really wrestling the ideas to the ground.
Yeah, I love that term, mushy middle. In that mushy middle place, I don't think we can ever do better than sort of mediocre work. Nobody's doing world-class, A+, outstanding, breakthrough, innovative work if they're mucking around in the mushy middle.
Exactly right. And so we have to force ourselves to that. And that's why we need to drive. It's so critical to have that trust, to have that psychological, that the safety that people know that they can express their opinion kind of without fear or favor, and know that, okay, if they've expressed their opinion and they're not able to persuade their teammates, but typically they'll still then be committed to the idea, right? And that's actually okay. There's a lot of data that says if people at least have felt that their point of view has been legitimately heard, even if they don't get their preferred solution, they will be equally committed to delivering the solution that the team has come up with. Whereas if the person believes that, okay, they haven't had a fair chance to be heard, then they're not going to be committed to the decision that the team has taken.
Now the creation of trust is hard enough in an environment where everyone's, speaks the same first language, and they come from the same general culture and tradition and worldview and all that stuff. But you've operated much of your career in environments that are very different and diverse, and you've got people from different cultural foundations coming together, trying to pursue a mission and create a team. And I'm thinking specifically about your work in the Middle East. I've been to the Middle East a couple of times and led training there and done work in that environment, and it's just different. Everything felt different to me. So I'm curious, do you have any stories or examples from those very diverse team settings where teams were able to build trust, or what are some special challenges maybe in those settings? Tell us about tell us an interesting story, I guess, about a team building trust in a very diverse setting.
Yeah, no, exactly right. So a couple of interesting things about the Middle East, of course, and is that particularly in professional settings, 80 to 90% of the organization are typically not citizens of the country. And so the first thing to be aware of is people's employment, people's residency, the ability for them and their family to remain, say, in the United Arab Emirates or in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia. That for their family to stay there, they have to keep their job. And if you lose your job, you typically have to leave within 60 days. That actually is a huge barrier to really effective conflict, because people don't necessarily want to put their jobs at risk. And so there's a kind of a high degree of self-censorship that sometimes occurred. And I perhaps even in some regards, in some situations saw that myself and even did that myself around not wanting to disagree publicly, particularly with senior people, because you don't want to put your job at risk and your family's ability to stay in the country. So you have to be aware of that. Then the second element is, if I look at my little trust equation, it's the idea of intimacy. In many countries in the Middle East, it's not normal for people to socialize. It's not normal for people to do anything after work, or much less normal than it is in other contexts. And so the idea of building up that personal intimacy, the personal connections, is just a little bit harder. And some people, part of intimacy, part of building up personal understanding of each other is disclosing things about your family, your life, your career story, etc., to help people understand who you are as a human being. I found several times people just would refuse to engage in that type of exercise in some cultures. They're like, no, that's private. I come to work. You have me from 9 to 5 or from 8 to 6. I give my full best to work, but no, I'm not going to disclose too much about my private setting. And people have every right to do that. You want to create, if people are not comfortable doing it, then you can't force them into doing it. And so therefore, and there is a therefore, what else do you look at as a way to kind of create a proxy of intimacy without some of the personal stuff? And that's where, honestly, Mike, I defer to tools like things like SDI, which you're very familiar with, even basic things like DISC and Myers-Briggs and Hogan. And, we were heavy users of different personality inventories as a proxy to help get people to introduce themselves to their colleagues, right? As part of building intimacy is, okay, if I understand your Hogan profile or your SDI profile, that at least gives me a language with which to converse with you, and at least a little bit of an understanding of why you might behave in a particular way differently to how I might have behaved. So really my core lesson is given some of the difficulties of creating that kind of informal intimacy, using tools and using constructs like a Myers-Briggs or an SDI or a DISC or a Hogan is a really, really helpful way. And we did a lot of team effectiveness work in the Middle East using those tools as the basis for disclosure, as the basis then for feedback that at least helped us get some of the way in terms of creating that trust that we needed in order to have the right conflict.
I would imagine another inhibitor of intimacy, bringing the story home back here to the States and other parts of the world for that matter too, is the rise of remote work and the virtual office. And, we were all forced to go home during the pandemic, and some people have stayed home. Others are migrating back into the office. But how does remote work, virtual office become a barrier to the creation of trust and especially the element of intimacy? How do we work around that or overcome those barriers?
You're dead on, Mike. You're 100% spot on. And I think there's actually some data on this that people who joined a new company during the pandemic have typically had a slower ramp up and a slower onboarding if they're working remotely versus being in the office. Because in order to because it is the coffee machine conversations, that it's the multiple repeated informal interactions that can really help build up that personal intimacy that then goes into trust, right? That it is the how was your weekend discussions that we often think are banal, but eventually we all get to know each other and we understand why each other acts like that. So look, I think, remote work is real, and it's a huge advantage, and it's an enabler of us to get talent from all around the country to work at Amcor. And so we've got plenty of people who are working 100% remote. What I've tried to do is effectively try as much as possible to mirror the coffee machine into the Zoom settings, right? So many of our meetings are Microsoft Teams or Zoom, and we try as much as possible to just spend 5, 10, 15 minutes at the beginning of each meeting with, getting people to share something that's going on with their life or something important that happened to them, and try and kind of recreate those coffee machine milestones. And I think many organizations are adopting that same approach. We at Amcor, we call it the Amcor moment, right? Getting everyone to just share often something personal at the beginning of the meeting, not related to the agenda. And that's hard to do because, people are busy and it looks like wasted effort that's wasted time that's baked into the agenda. But actually, I really think it does pay out. And that's why I'm pretty insistent upon it in the virtual meetings that I participate in. And I've learned a lot more about my colleagues who I've got colleagues in South Carolina and in California and in Indiana that I've not met yet, but I sense I know something about them because I've interacted with them multiple times, over Zoom. And so hopefully have some kind of a personal connection with.
That's great. Those of my listeners who have listened to several episodes know that my penultimate question in every interview, every conversation with my guest is always this one. As we start to land the plane and we start to move toward the conclusion of our conversation, is Pete, you've done this a long time. You've got great insight. What's one thing our listeners could begin doing right away to promote more effective teamwork, more open dialogue, more trust? Give us one thing that I can start doing tomorrow morning that will make me better.
Feedback. So integrating it. So become a feedback engine for your team. Start giving feedback, whether you're the leader of the team or a member of the team. At the end of it, take notes of what different people are doing in team meetings, or just observe and start giving people feedback about what they did well and what they could do better. That is the greatest, and you will then be a personal role model of team effectiveness, right? Because if you give feedback to someone, it is the absolute greatest way to build that bond of trust. If you give feedback, hey, Mike, I thought you did this really well at the meeting, and I thought you could have done that a little bit better. It will shock people at the beginning, but then people would love it. And if you start giving people feedback in a way that's really helpful for them, that will create a huge sense of intimacy for you. That will help you be more effective as a member of that team.
That is an awesome piece of advice. And it sounds like you've just set yourself up, Pete, for a return visit to the podcast to talk about feedback, because that was a great launch point for a whole new conversation.
Absolutely. Happy to do.
But our time together is drawing to a close here for this episode. So, Pete, I'm sure people have enjoyed this and may want to continue the conversation with you, or just connect with you and follow you on LinkedIn, or, however you want them to connect with you. What is the best way for people to stay in touch with you?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Hit me up on LinkedIn. Just look for Pete Baker, Amcor, AMCOR, Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm reasonably visible on LinkedIn, so happy to connect with anybody and continue the conversation. So it's been a real pleasure to be part of this. It's great always to connect back with you, Mike. So thanks for inviting me on the show, and look forward to seeing what's next.
Pete, thanks for being a great guest on the Mission First, People Always podcast. Hey, this has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot and enjoyed catching up with Pete. And if you're hearing this, in other words, if you're listening to the end of the podcast, you probably care deeply about how to improve teamwork and what it takes to do that. And what it takes to do that often begins with the kind of teammate you are. It begins with you honestly answering the question, what's it like to be on the other end of me? What kind of impact am I having on my teammates, on the people I work with? We also learned today that trust is the foundation of highly effective teams. Trust is built when the people on the team are credible, reliable, and they know each other. There's a sense of intimacy that breeds psychological safety. And of course, there has to be a degree of selflessness that puts the collective interest of the team above one's own personal interest. Team members must put the team's interest first, above their own, if the team is truly going to be great. Again, thanks for listening. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe, follow, leave a review, and tell a friend. You can learn more about what I do and connect with me at drmikepatterson.com. But always remember that people and performance go hand in hand. We'll look forward to having you join us next time on the Mission First, People Always podcast.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.